Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 646, and today is July 30th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Today we're going to be talking a lot about the shared values between America and Israel, a fact that our elected politicians always tout. So we'll talk about a little bit about what that actually means on today's show. But before we get into the content, first, I mentioned the Libertarian Institute fundraiser. It's going on right now, so if you head on over and make a donation, your donation will actually be doubled because we had a couple of high-level donors come in and offer us matching funds, which means if we're able to fundraise a certain amount, and right now it's $20,000, these donors will also make a $20,000 contribution. And so if you're making, $10, a $20, a $50 donation, those are all going to be doubled effectively for the Institute. Also, you get yourself some great kickbacks when you make donations to the Institute. You could get yourself a copy of one of our books or some Institute swag. We publish a lot of great books at the Institute. I would highly recommend Let's Rights by James Bovard or Diarrhea by Psychosis, Tom Woods' book on the COVID pandemic. Both of those books are out within the past year, but of course we have 14 books that you could choose from. Additionally, we have new books coming out all the time. Keith Knight's working on a couple. Scott Horton is working on Provoked. All those will be out in the forthcoming year. There's daily content at the Libertarian Institute. Of course, you have this show, Conflicts of Interest, and several other great podcasts, including the Scott Horton Show, Vital Descent, Don't Tread on Anyone, Year Zero, and Chasing Ghosts. You have daily news articles that I write, also a daily news letter that I send out, and we have a featured article section, so op-eds every day for issues across the libertarian spectrum. So, of course, we cover foreign policy and all the, issues that kind of get covered on this show, Julian Assange, freedom of speech, but we also cover other libertarian economics things. So if you're interested in that stuff, head on over to the Libertarian Institute, check it out. You really should be heading to the Institute every day. We have so much great libertarian content there. While you're there, make a donation. I do know there are several members of this audience who have already donated. I just want to say I really appreciate it. It keeps us doing what we are doing. Of course, when you look at the world today, there's so much, kind of establishment legacy media, and they're always directing the narrative, and they're constantly working to spin 100% hypocrisy all the time. We'll talk about on today's show, they constantly warn and hyperventilate over election denialism, and then when an election somewhere in the world doesn't go the way the State Department wants, the State Department turns into the world's biggest election deniers. So let's get into today's show. As always, you can find all my work by following me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. Also, this show is on YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version, and up anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. So starting off on today's show, I'm going to break down this article from the Washington Post. And yesterday we had two major stories when it came to torture at Israeli prisons. This one broke first, so I'm going to tackle it first. The Washington Post reports the details of prisoners' deaths were recounted by eyewitness and corroborated by Physicians for Human Rights, Israel PHRI, who sat in on autopsies. In the findings, which were shared with families obtained by the Washington Post, the three men are among at least 13 Palestinians from the West Bank and Israel to die in Israeli jail since October 7th, according to PHRI. An unknown number of prisoners from the Gaza Strip have also died. The Post spoke with 11 former prisoners and half a dozen lawyers who examined court documents and reviewed autopsy reports, revealing rampant, sometimes deadly violence and deprivation by Israeli prison authorities. So as we mentioned there in that intro part, and I just want to emphasize this, we are only talking about here prisoners who are held in prisons that they take people from Israel and the West Bank from. So anybody from Gaza, they're going to be in different facilities and likely actually facing worse treatment than we're going to get into on today's show. So this is what the Washington Post recounted. Officers raided a cell on the wing and handcuffed the inmates before beating them. According to a 28-year-old prisoner who was detained in the same section, he said similar beatings happened twice a week while he was incarcerated. He said, the guards went crazy in a way. They used their batons. They kicked us all over our bodies. After the beating, the inmate said other members of his cell were taken to an area of isolation rooms nicknamed Tora Bora after the Al-Qaeda Afghan cave network. The noise of the screams was all over the section, he said. He said the prisoner returned with deep bruises, complaining his ribs were broken. When he sought medical assistance, he was sent back with a simple painkiller, so something like a Tylenol. In the end, he was incapable of standing on his feet. We helped him walk around as if he was a child. He died 3 weeks later on January 1st. So, reports of medical assistance being denied are pervasive in the testimonies from prisoners. The death of Muhammad AlSabar, 21, on February 28th could have been avoided if his chronic condition had been treated properly, according to PHRI, who sat in on his autopsy. His family said he was arrested for incitement in connection with posts he made online. So here we have a young man. Imagine this in America, by the way. We have somebody, right, who posts something on his Facebook account, on Twitter, Instagram, whatever, about the local police force, right? He says that they beat his mama and his little sister too. Maybe true, lie, doesn't really matter, right? He posted. So the local police come around, scoop him up and throw him in a jail. And then there they beat him to death. Now, obviously, that would be a horrifying situation, and we would all be extremely concerned about that. It would be a huge blow to the freedom of speech, our First Amendment right, and the Bill of Rights overall. You know, there's other things in the Bill of Rights: no cruel and unusual punishment. You get a trial before you get punished, right? So, in America, something like this would be trampling over all of our rights, and yet it's happening with frequency in Israeli prisons. Again, these are just 13 prisoners that the Washington Post has documented, and they're the people who were fortunate enough to get autopsies, to be put in prisons where they actually get counted and recorded, unlike the people who are scooped up from Gaza. And of course, there was the testimonials of the prisoners to line up with them. You know, if the Palestinians were still in jail, they wouldn't have the ability to talk with the Washington Post about what they witnessed in these prison torture facilities. And so right here, we could already see just the basic actions that Israel is being accused of, denying people medical treatment within jail and beating them to death, are things that we absolutely abhor in the United States of America. Yet when our elected officials come around, talk to us and explain why we have to send $20 billion in weapons to Israel in the coming year, they say Israel is one of the most moral countries. They have the most moral army on the face of the earth. We have shared values with Israel. And because of all of those reasons, we need to continue to support Israel because it helps America in the Middle East. So back to this Washington Post article here. Some said coverings were removed from cell windows in the winter to expose them to the cold. Others said the Israeli national anthem was played incessantly at high volumes. Lights were left on at night to disturb their sleep. So we're talking about, typical torture tactics here, right? There are certainly worse things that you could do to a person: waterboarding, cruel beatings, stress positions. Of course, we know from Guantanamo Bay, there was something called the Palestinian chair, which was essentially a stress position that would ultimately break someone's back, that they would put people in. And it was, of course, called the Palestinian chair because the Americans learned it from the Israelis, where they had perfected, or, saying that crudely, perfected the method on Palestinians. And so, we shouldn't be surprised by any of this. However, again, as we're constantly given this barrage of propaganda that Israel is some super moral army, this should all be extremely disturbing to Americans, because this is all being done on our dime, our taxpayer dollars, and with the full-throated support of our government. So one Palestinian prisoner was beaten in front of a judge as he joined a hearing via video link in November, according to his lawyer and court records reviewed by the Post. Violence and medical negligence were each accompanied by withholding food, former prisoners recounted. Each said they had lost significant weight, shedding between 30 and 50 pounds. And so, again, here are two more things you can't even imagine happening in the United States. You have a prisoner being beaten in front of the judge. I mean, completely absurd. And also, it's not just one or two prisoners who are recounting this extreme weight loss. And we're not talking about people who, could lose 30 or 50 pounds. We're talking about relatively healthy, not everybody's lean with 5% body fat, of course, but, we're talking about relatively healthy within the appropriate range of the BMI people who are still losing between 30 and 50 pounds because they were held in Israeli prisons. So one amateur bodybuilder said he lost more than 100 pounds in 9 months. He whispered as he described the guard sexually assaulting him with a broom. And I mean, I think we all know what that means, but I felt like this is, by the way, the last two paragraphs of the Washington Post article. So they don't highlight that the Israeli prison guards were raping their prisoners with brooms, but that is what's happening here. His doctor said he was suffering from post-traumatic stress and malnutrition, and he described it as Guantanamo. So when the initial Guantanamo Bay, the war on terror, was happening, I was in high school, and I distinctly remember that when it came out what the U.S. was doing, we were running this massive torture prison for Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib. There was a lot of shame for Americans. This was something that we were not proud of. And of course, there are those types, particularly at the time, conservatives and those who are just diehard lovers of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, who came out to the American people and tried to sell this to us, right? They said, it's not torture, they're exaggerating. And of course, when anybody actually looks at what was done and what they were even trying to do to the prisoners, it's clear that it was torture. There's really no doubt about that now. And the American people were horrified. And there are even talks about prosecuting Bush and Cheney over the torture program. Of course, the only person who ends up going to jail for it is John Kiriakou. I guess also you could include a little bit Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange there, who are the people who blew the whistle and who released documents about the Guantanamo Bay torture program, but none of the people who were actually behind the torture or the psychologists who designed the program actually end up going to prison for this. And it's hard to imagine after reading through that story that this actually gets worse for Israel, but it does. So this one from Haret on July 29th, it was released just a couple hours after the Washington Post expose. Israeli military police arrest soldiers for sexual abuse of Palestinians, causing protests from top officials. So Haret's report, the Israeli military police officers raided the Said Tamim detention center on Monday and detained 9 soldiers on suspicion of abusing a Palestinian detainee. Following reports of the detention of the soldiers, dozens of protesters, including Knesset members, broke into the base and protested against the detention of the soldiers. According to a security source, the Palestinian detainee was taken to the hospital with severe injuries to an intimate body part, including injuries that left him without the ability to walk. And so, again, just to spell this out because Haretz doesn't, and I read a few different reports of exactly the nature of the sexual abuse, but it was rape. Like, things were inserted into this man that should not have been. And it seems to either have been just a torture or even maybe a joke by the Israeli soldiers that they were just doing very cruel things to this man because they could. I mean, the stories I read are absolutely sick, and I don't want to repeat them on this show. Just know that this man was raped so brutally he was unable to walk. The arrest sparked clashes between the military police and the soldiers at the facility, as well as protesters and officials who gathered outside the facility. So I guess there was a legitimate scuffle between the soldiers who run the prison. And by the way, this is the prison that the Gazans are held at. This isn't one of the prisons that would have been discussed, written about in the Washington Post story. And so you have the situation where the military police, they're so disgusted by what they see, right? You could imagine a situation where some police officers, some soldiers see something that other soldiers and police officers did and are so horrified and disgusted, they actually go to arrest the perpetrator. I mean, this almost never happens. This is, I guess, one of those real shared values between the Americans and the Israelis. We tend not to hold to account our soldiers and our police officers for war crimes or abuses that they commit. But it's far worse in Israel. So again, imagine like Derek Chauvin gets arrested or something for killing George Floyd, and the police officers, first of all, try to prevent the arrest by actually attacking the other police officers. That's what happens in this jail. But once they are actually placed under detention, you have members of Congress coming out and not only protesting against the arrest, but actually forcing their way into the facility and trying to release Derek Chauvin. I mean, that's what we're actually talking about happening here. So National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir responded to the reports of the detention, saying the spectacle of military police officers coming to our arrest are best heroes, right? We're talking about accused rapists, and Ben-Gvir calls them their best heroes in the detention facility is nothing less than shameful. I recommend the defense minister, the chief of the IDF staff, and the military authorities to back up the fighters and learn from the prison service. Light treatment of terrorists is over. Soldiers need to have our full support. And the reason that this statement is so concerning, right? It's not Ben-Gvir, just some member of the Knesset. He's the national security minister. He runs the prison system in Gaza. And of course, when the State Department gets asked in the coming days, whether it's Patel, Miller, or Blinken, they're going to basically tell the reporters asking them questions about this story that we're going to defer to our Israeli partners here. Well, when you ask the Israeli partners about what's happening in these prisons, Ben-Gvir has been very clear. He has said that he has made the conditions for the prisoners worse by cutting their food, more beatings, less room, and he even says that the way we take care of this prison overcrowding situation isn't by building more prisons, it's by simply executing people that he thinks are terrorists. And so it's the rhetoric from the Israelis around this issue is extremely disturbing, and our government bends to them fully anytime they have any issues. So there were other members of the Knesset that showed up here. I'm guessing this is going to be something that I continue to update in the days and the weeks to come, this story. There is some people out there speculating that this could actually lead to some kind of civil war-esque conflict in Israel. I'm not sure that will go that far. How many people will actually be willing to die to defend a man who raped another man in Israel is a big question. I'm not really sure that there's going to be that much support to like go to war over these rapists. At the same time, the support is coming from Bezalel Smotrich and again Ben-Gvir. Netanyahu called for calm but didn't necessarily denounce what the soldiers had done or denounce what the military police had done. So it's a little unclear of how he's feeling about this. But overall, it does seem that large swaths of the Israeli government are embracing the soldiers who raped this Palestinian man. And it's extremely disgusting and disturbing. All right, let's move on to some news about the war in Ukraine. This one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on July 29th. F-16s to appear in Ukraine within weeks will operate far from front. So Ukraine is set to begin receiving F-16 fighter jets from its Western backers later this week after months of delays. The advanced aircraft will serve in a limited role out of a fear they will be easily shot down by Russian air defenses. Well over a year after the U.S. and its NATO allies announced a plan to train Ukrainian pilots on the F-16 and supply the jet to Kiev, the first batch of warplanes is expected to be operational in a matter of weeks. The arrival of the American-made aircraft is not expected to have a major impact on the fighting. It's unclear if any F-16s have arrived in Ukraine yet. Officials in Kiev say they are in the process of moving them into the country, but have declined to say how many planes they would receive, the New York Times reported. According to the Washington Post, the advanced aircraft are expected to be operating far from the front lines and mainly focus on downing Russian missiles and drones. The U.S. administration is concerned that Russian air defenses will be able to quickly defeat the F-16s. So the paper wrote, officials have said that the planes, at least initially, are unlikely to fly too close to the front line fighting, meaning it is unclear if they will be able to deter attacking Russian aircraft from crossing into Ukraine from Russia. Kiev had hoped to receive the warplanes by the end of 2023, and in fact, they were hoping for them by the end of their summer counteroffensive in 2023, but delays in pilot training pushed back the delivery several months. Ukrainian military officials have lamented that the delays mean the F-16s will have little impact on the battlefield, as Russia is well prepared for their arrival. According to the Post, only a limited number of F-16s will be delivered to Ukraine this year, and just 6 pilots have completed the training program so far. Ukrainian forces also face dire missile shortages, further limiting the use of the aircraft. The F-16s will carry AIM-120 air-to-air missiles that also function as interceptors for the U.S.-supplied NAMAS air defense systems, though Ukraine is now running low on that munition as well. Ukraine is also likely to struggle to maintain its airfields to support the fighter jets with all of its existing airstrips within range of Russian munitions. Officials have suggested that Kiev could store its F-16s at air bases in other NATO countries, and one explained to the Post that it is not possible to construct new concrete hangars in Ukraine during wartime. In the early days of the war, President Joe Biden promised the American people he would not send advanced tanks and warplanes to Ukraine out of fear it could cause a direct conflict with Russia. However, last year, the White House moved away from that pledge and approved a plan for Belgium, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Norway to send about 80 F-16s to Ukraine while the U.S. and other allies trained the pilots. The Kremlin views the F-16s in Ukraine as highly provocative, as the aircraft are capable of carrying nuclear weapons. The members of NATO sending F-16s to Ukraine have now put restrictions on where the aircraft can operate, and some members have explicitly authorized Kiev to use the warplanes to bomb Russia. So this is Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and this is what he said last July. Just one example of an extremely dangerous turn of events is the United States plans to transfer F-16 fighter jets to the Kiev regime. We have informed the nuclear powers, the United States, Britain, and France, that Russia cannot ignore the ability of these aircraft to carry nuclear weapons. No amount of assurances will help here. So, again, this is a major provocation and extremely concerning. Now, the U.S. has also announced a massive weapons package for Ukraine. This is Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. He writes, the Pentagon on Friday announced that it was providing Ukraine with new weapons package worth $1.7 billion, which includes munitions for air defenses, ammunition for HIMARS, artillery shells, and other types of equipment. The package includes $1.5 billion that will be provided through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, the USAI. The USAI allows the U.S. to purchase weapons for Ukraine, which means it could take months or years for the equipment to be delivered. The other $200 million uses the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows President Biden to ship weapons to Ukraine directly from Pentagon stockpiles. The announcement came a few days after the Pentagon said it found an accounting error that overvalued previous weapons sent to Ukraine, freeing up another $2 billion to be sent on the proxy war, and we'll have more on that in a couple minutes. The new U.S. military aid comes as Russian forces are making steady gains in the east and are closing in on a major Donetsk city. So according to the Pentagon, the new package includes munitions for the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems. Those are the AIM-20 missiles that will also be fired from the F-16s, short and medium-range air defense munitions, RAM-7 missiles for air defenses, electronic warfare equipment, HIMARS, 155mm and 105mm artillery round. No indication if those are cluster or unitary warheads. 120mm mortar rounds, precision aerial munitions, tube-launched optically tracked wire-guided tow missiles, Javelin and AT-4 armor systems, small arms, explosive material and demolitions equipment and munitions, secure communication systems, commercial satellite imagery services, spare parts, maintenance and sustainment support, and other ancillary equipment. The Pentagon also released a fact sheet on Monday that said the Biden administration has pledged more than $55.4 billion in military equipment for Ukraine since Russia launched its invasion of February 22. The funds for the new weapons package are being pulled from the $61 billion Ukraine spending that included $95 billion was included in the $95 billion foreign military aid bill President Biden signed into law in April, adding up the $61 billion with previous spending. That brings the total cost of the proxy war since February of 2022 to about $186 billion. All right. Let's talk now about that $2 billion accounting error. This one from our friend Connor Freeman at antiwar.com on July 26th. Pentagon finds another $2 billion in Ukraine aid accounting errors. So the Pentagon discovered $2 billion in additional accounting errors regarding its valuation of missiles, ammos, and other equipment provided to Kiev. A GAO report found on Thursday. The Department of Defense made a similar claim last year, saying it availed Washington of $6.2 billion in weapons to fuel the Ukraine proxy war with Russia. So the latest report brings the improperly valued military equipment to a total of $8.2 billion, with the error said to be a result of accounting definitions. In June of 2023, the Pentagon insisted that weapons shipped to Ukraine from U.S. military stockpiles under the Presidential Drawdown Authority, or the PDA, over the past 2 years were overvalued using the replacement value of the arms as opposed to the depreciated value. This brought the White House some time to continue sending weapons to Kiev after much of the funding then allocated to the war had dried up. And so let me explain this, because if I pulled some accounting trick like this on my tax forms, I would be in jail from the IRS. So what the U.S. government did is, when they send weapons out through the Presidential Drawdown Authority, these are weapons from the U.S. stockpile going out. So these are arms that are supposed to be available to the U.S. Armed Forces. And so let's say we send a Humvee. I'm just going to use one, or a HIMARS system as an example, to Ukraine. Well, we're sending one from our stockpile to Ukraine. And so the money that is needed by the U.S. government to replace that HIMARS is the replacement value, because now we have to pay the military industrial complex to build and deliver a whole new system to the United States. It doesn't just cost the U.S. taxpayer the value of the HIMARS sent to Ukraine. The cost to the U.S. taxpayer is the cost of the new HIMARS to replace the one that was sent to Ukraine. And so that's why the replacement value should be used. You could imagine if, say, you're going to send 100 HIMARS, right? Well, the depreciated value, and who knows what the depreciated value of a HIMARS is. It's not like the used car market where you have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people buying and trading used Hondas and Toyotas and Fords. And so then you could come up with a real market value of what a used Ford Taurus is worth, or whatever, right? Ford Focus, whatever that's worth. Now, because this is the U.S. government and they could kind of do what they want, after months and months, or after a year and a half of providing Ukraine weapons through the Presidential Drawdown Authority, and then depleting all their funds, because, right, when we send them those HIMARS, we had to have funds to buy a new HIMARS. And so once we depleted all those funds, the Pentagon looked at it and said, those HIMARS we sent to Ukraine, they were only worth about, a third, a quarter of what they were worth new. And so this freed up first $6.2 billion, and now another $2 billion in funds that we could send to Ukraine. I mean, this is completely ridiculous accounting. First of all, again, it should be highly illegal. And it really upsets me that there aren't members of Congress that are outraged about this, that are holding hearings. I mean, this seems like a major oversight issue to me. And let me explain why it's such a major oversight issue. And so now, let's say again, we're going to use 100 HIMARS, right? We've sent 100 HIMARS to Ukraine. The Pentagon comes through and they say, they're only worth 20% of what they were new. And so we actually now have funds to send 80% more, whatever that money was, to Ukraine. And so then they send all of that out. Well, now we've sent hundreds and hundreds of arms to Ukraine, but we only have funds to buy 25 HIMARS, right? And so that means there's going to be a massive deficit in the U.S. stockpiles because we've sent far more weapons to Ukraine than we have money to replenish our own stockpiles. And so this should be, again, a major issue in the U.S. Congress, a major oversight issue, a major issue by the U.S. government. What the White House is doing here is completely illegal. It's fleecing the American people. It's completely taking advantage of the Constitution. I mean, Congress is supposed to have the power of the purse. And so if there are not funds to fund a war, the White House is supposed to have to not wage that war, not find some accounting trick to be able to continue moving forward with it. But of course that won't happen, and we're just going to move forward with the status quo. All right, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, July 29th, antiwar.com. European Union transfers $1.6 billion from frozen Russian assets to buy arms for Ukraine. So the European Union announced it was transferring about $1.6 billion in frozen Russian central bank assets to Ukraine for the purchase of weapons. This step is the first time the EU has dipped into the frozen Russian assets to fund the proxy war and marks a significant escalation in the Western economic campaign against Moscow. The transfer came after the European Union agreed to provide Ukraine with about $3.2 billion per year using profits made by the Russian assets. The EU has agreed to a U.S. proposed loan of $50 billion to Ukraine and pay it back using the frozen Russian funds, but it's unclear when that will go through. According to Euronews, 90% of the $1.6 billion will go towards weapons and 10% will be spent on humanitarian aid, but the money is being wired directly into the Ukrainian government's budget, and it's unclear if there is any oversight, so it could just go right up Zelensky's nose. Russia has vowed that it will respond to the EU or any Western country stealing its central bank assets. Western banks have warned against the plan to send Russian assets to Ukraine, as they fear will open up legal action if they are involved in any transfers. The Ukrainian justice minister previously called the EU plan to send $3.2 billion each year, almost nothing, and demanded that Kiev send the approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank assets that are being held by the West. And this seems similar to how a lot of the war has played out, where the West will do highly provocative things, often citing the cause of Kiev, but it's not enough to actually change the outcome of the war. $3.2 billion a year, in one sense, it is very significant and a lot, because we're talking about stealing $3.2 billion from Russia and giving it to Ukraine. But in the scheme of the actual battle, $3.2 billion isn't going to make a dent in the amount, Ukraine's asking for hundreds of billions of dollars. And so $3.2 billion isn't going to make a dent at all, especially if that money one day has to be paid back to Russia. So this is a real foolish provocation on behalf of the West. And we've seen this time and time again throughout the war. It's similar with the F-16s, right? It's highly provocative to Russia because they could carry nuclear weapons. But on the Ukrainian side, they don't have pilots. They can't fly them close to the border. They don't have arms for them. They don't have airfields for them. It's not going to make a major change in the actual war. So why do it? Why provoke Russia more? Maybe because what the West really wants here is to keep Russia fighting and essentially on end. Now, last story up here today. Let's get into some election denialism. U.S. accuses Venezuela of election manipulation after Maduro victory, threatens sanctions. So U.S. officials on Monday accused Venezuela of election manipulation and suggested more sanctions could be implemented on the country after President Nicolas Maduro secured a third 6-year presidential term. Venezuela's election authority said Maduro won 51% of the vote, while the leading opposition candidate received 44%. The opposition is disputing the results, claiming Gonzalez really won by a wide margin. Two U.S. officials speaking to reporters called on the election authority to release a detailed breakdown of the vote. So one official said, I think what we would like to see happen next is to have the National Election Council publish the detailed precinct level results to see if they do in fact have the receipts that can both verify and justify the electoral results that they announced last night. The official did not announce any new sanctions, but said more would come. We are faced with a potentially new scenario. We are going to have to take that into account as we map forward where they may respect to sanctions towards Venezuela. And so, of course, if it's an American election and we're asking for, this kind of accountability, oversight, and raising questions about an election result, oh no, you're an election denier, you should be canceled, you hate democracy. And yet when it happens in any country we don't like and the election goes the way we don't like, suddenly then we question the election. And not only that, even if the election, there's no inconsistencies to note, and I'm not saying that's the case in Venezuela, I have no idea yet, but let's say there are no inconsistencies to note, the U.S. government will still put sanctions on that country and still deny the results of the election. So, elections have really just become a tool of U.S. imperialism around the world, where we say, oh, we have to have democracy, but that democracy really only counts if the elections go the way the Americans want. If not, then it's not democracy. Somebody rigged the election, whether it's Maduro or Putin or election interference, China, and we put more sanctions on the country, and sometimes we even set up a government with somebody who didn't even win the election. So John Bolton, Trump's former national security advisor, recently acknowledged that the administration knew the sanctions campaign would cause suffering in Venezuela and contribute to migration out of the country. There is no doubt that the sanctions, along with the general economic deterioration before we imposed them, was driving a lot of people out of the country. That, to me, was a way to put pressure on the country. And so this is the little secret of sanctions, right? When they first put them on and they're selling them to the American people, they say, oh, we have to do this for the people, for the Venezuelan people, for the Russian people, for the Cuban people. The deal is that our sanctions are going to help the people by hurting their government. They say, oh, look, Maduro gets fat off his people, that he lives a good life while his people live poor lives. And so if we put sanctions on them, then Maduro will suffer. In reality, what they end up telling you years later is that the real plan is that the sanctions will cause so much suffering among the people that they will rise up and overthrow their government. Of course, that never happens, and reasonably so. If the American government was blockaded by another country, you would, of course, see a rally around the flag effect. It would look like 9/11 after this country, where everybody has their yards painted in American flags and everybody has an American flag up. But of course, our elected leaders really, it's a matter of if they don't care, or a John Bolton type who I think probably sees the sanctions as a precursor to war, right? We had to sanction a country for a few years, and then we could throw up our arms and say, oh, well, the sanctions aren't working, so I guess we need to use a kinetic military operation. So sanctions, the economic war, is really just a precursor to a regular war. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show today. I have more for you later this week.